Hello, everyone, and welcome to CTM Festival's Discourse program. My name is Anita, Jóri, one of the curators of the Discourse program, and I'm really honored to introduce the panel discussion, Hidden Flows. It focuses on the live music sector and its hidden labor and arrangements, and I think we are going to have a really nice discussion this afternoon. And based on their research and own experience, the panelists will also reflect on the actual situation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And our main question for this afternoon is, what are some of the hidden processes at work and how might we begin to address them? And to answer this question, music researcher Shzr Ee Tan will suggest alternative pathways for music and digital culture that eschew the othering hegemony of Western innovation and techno-optimism. Then Anjeline De Dios will examine how notions of authenticity based on race are used to devalue and exploit live music circuits in Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, I have to announce that our third presenter, Rehilwe Mooketsi, couldn't make it today, so we will have only 2 presentations this afternoon. And keep in mind that after the 2 presentations, there will be a live discussion between the 2 panelists and also with the public. So whenever you feel like sending in questions, either on Discord or on YouTube, please feel free to do that, and we are going to forward them to the panelists. And now I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Shzr Ee Tan. She is a senior lecturer and ethnomusicologist with specialism in Sinophone and Southeast Asian worlds at Royal Holloway University of London, where she's also current director of postgraduate studies in the music department. She has also initiated campaigns, including on an ongoing safe space discussion series and workshops on topics ranging from interethnic solidarity to mental health and toxic masculinity. Shzr completed her PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and her research interests include digital inequality, global sons, indigeneity, and gender-related issues. And her presentation's title is Digital Inequalities and Global Musical Flows, which we are going to watch right now.
Hello, welcome to the CTM Berlin Festival. My name is Shzr Ee Tan, and I am a senior lecturer as well as ethnomusicologist at the music department at Royal Holloway, University of London. As you can see, I'm apparently a cyber creature, a cyborg, enmeshed into the wonderful fusion metallic background that is the unofficial branding of the CTM festival as a result of green screen technology. It's really a technological glitch, but I'm actually liking it and leaning into it because I think it's very much apropos of the theme of my talk today, which is on digital inequalities and hidden musical flows. But I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm actually a real human being, as you can see here, although my human nature is probably better appreciated when I'm going to be shortly, right now, sharing with you my slides for the talk today. And you won't be looking at too many strange technological glitches because I'm sure in the course of presenting some unintended ones are going to creep up. So speaking of technology and the title of my talk today, I'd like to sort of dive in straight away and get people thinking about the context behind this talk, which is how we're living in the time of a lot of fetishization of technological frontiers, alongside the problematization of this sense of urgency around digital frontiers. I'm going to pose this question. Are we talking about digital frontiers or really political frontiers? And what does music have to do with this? There might be some answers I'll share later, especially when we talk about the fetishization of newness and its dangers and opportunities that have been posed, whether we're talking about musical AI, helping you build Spotify playlists, or algocracy, surveillance, data harvesting on Alexa and Siri, or alienation and dehumanization in the latest TikTok videos that everyone's complaining about on social media. At the same time that there are a lot of fears, there's also a lot of digital optimism around music technology, which has been thought of as a savior of the music sector and various music industries, whether you're talking about game music, everyone wants to be a game composer now, or how it's actually the savior of Western art music departments, which are very much losing recruitment of performers, well, within North America, Europe, and the UK, for all sorts of reasons that have got to do with the prioritization of the sciences versus the arts in education systems, especially in the UK. And then you add to all of this, this very strange time of COVID-19 that we're living through, really a pandemic age, that has brought a different kind of focus on technological affordance through Zoom, which is very much what we're doing today. I'm recording this on Zoom, you're probably watching and taking part in this festival and conference around the festival via Zoom. And what does it say about us and who's here and who's not here? And finally, I think we're having all these conversations amidst a lot of fears or denial, maybe, around climate change, and especially the roles of musicians. What is the cost of music technology and music to the environment? Is it enough to think about relative roles and responsibilities, or is it something that is just part of our everyday life that we cannot help, and we should maybe refocus on broader politics? That's something that I think it's worth having a conversation about. And finally, because I am Southeast Asian, was born in Singapore, and even though I've been living in the UK for 20 years, do think of myself as someone who should be committed to decolonizing music. And alongside decolonizing music, there's also a need to decolonize music technology, or rather technological debates and digital debates around musics. So in the slides that are to follow, hopefully we can have a conversation about something that's very densely layered, and issues that are deeply interconnected and intersectional. So what I'm going to do is to present multiple other views of musical flows, hidden musical flows, and multiple other discourses of music and digitality, with a particular focus on the inequalities which we don't observe so much, as well as the inequalities that we already know about. So first, I'll be looking at recentering and decentering and decolonizing digital music flows. And then I'll be talking about the case study of transient workers in Singapore, where maybe we'll spend some time looking at effective labor and effective leisure. And if there's time, a quick view of the digital music world from a Chinese perspective, and finally end on a postscript on post-digitality, post-humanism, and understanding musical and sounded worlds in post-human contexts. So let's start with the first one, which is counter discourse number 1. Let's recenter, decolonize, and rethink musical flows. The first chart that you see here is one of internet user distribution around the world in 2021. I don't know how many of you here are quite surprised to find that the largest sector that's taken up by the pie chart here, 53.4%, is actually users in Asia. There are more internet users in Asia than there are in Europe, which comes in at 14.3%, which is actually higher than North America at 6.7%, or Latin America, North America falling below Latin America. It really does make you think about who's using the internet, how many people are using the internet, and where they are, right? And where the different balances of digital power lie today. Now, if you compare this with internet penetration statistics, though, you get a slightly different picture, but also a very surprising picture, where North America is at 93.9% penetration. And then you see Asia is sort of in the middle, 63.8%, Africa at 43.2%, Europe at 88.2%. So how do we add up these statistics? Maybe they don't add up, and that's my whole point. We're looking at lots of hidden, layered discourses that may not necessarily be so obviously shown. Now, here's another chart, digging down further in terms of internet users by nation, by national territory. And no surprise, China is at the top here, even though its internet penetration rate is only 69% compared with the United States. And, you know, I think it's really important to bear in mind the kinds of asymmetries we're talking about here, because there are lots of impact when it comes to digital soundings. Okay, so a little bit more, you know, Hong Kong is a region of China, and, you know, the statistics that you will get from Hong Kong is probably going to be very different from somewhere in Hubei, as opposed to, you know, just for comparison, look at the statistics that you get for India, which is thought of as one of the most teched up areas in the world, but at the same time, it does not have such a great internet penetration rate of 53.8% compared to North America. And well, I'm talking about, you know, the current state of the world today. What about the current state of what, or the future states of internet penetration in terms of growth? You know, look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is growing at a rate of 3,271% and moving very, very fast, versus, you know, places that already have reached peak internet usage and penetration. And so what I'm trying to show to you is that there are flows within flows. More specifically, talking about music, let's have a look at something like Spotify, which is an app that all of us seem to be taking for granted. Its presence in Africa is pretty much at a nascent stage, although developing. And then you can look at how you look at the global spread of Spotify subscribers. North America, by far Europe by far the largest, and then North America, Latin America, and the rest of the world. And one thing that is not shown in this chart is the fact that Spotify is not available in one of the major territories, which is China. And that is very, very significant, because, you know, the things that we're taking for granted in the way we listen to music, the way we use technology, totally means something completely different when you realize that one huge community, one territory around the world is just used to listening to music, to making music, to engaging with technology in completely different ways. And you know, in some ways, these aren't even hidden flows. They're out there. It's just that we don't see it because we are blind, or we are blinkered, or maybe we don't hear it because we choose to deny, or we choose not to hear. So let's now get out of neocolonial thinking a little bit and think about how technological reach isn't necessarily the same as musical reach. And also to think about how maybe some of these flows that we're talking about don't have the so-called West or Europe or North America at the center, but actually have East Asia at the center. And on this, I would like to draw upon the work of Koichi Wabuchi, Leon Diploma on recirculations, and also Chen Guanxing on Asia as a method. So let's dig down, and I'll give you a very concrete case study, which is the story of the sounded lives and the musical lives of transient workers in Singapore. Now, Singapore is a city-state that is 1 degree north of the equator, so not quite the global south, but it's in Southeast Asia. It's a post-colonial, neo-colonial, decolonial state, which is Chinese-dominated, but is home to a very sizable population. I think 1 in 7 or even 1 in 6 people on the island are actually migrant workers from Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, the Philippines, and also from South Asia, Bangladesh, and parts of India. And these workers spend a lot of their time pretty much with only 1 or 2 days off in the case of per month, in the case of domestic workers, working in homes for very, very little pay. So we're talking about a particular class of citizens, or actually non-citizens in Singapore, if you like, who are still very much parts of the fabric of society in terms of, you know, population representation. what kind of sonic imprint do they have in this world? And how do they find different ways of sounding their lives and making use of digital technologies through music making and through re-representing their voices within these margins of operation. So I'm hoping that you can hear a little bit of this. So I'll pause for there. I've got lots more videos to share with you afterwards. Just drop me an email. So that is an example of transient workers from Indonesia congregating in a local mosque in Singapore, just stealing a precious moment of time pre-pandemic to rehearse together and sing nasheed, which is a kind of religious, not quite musical, but a religious devotional sounded expression that is an expression also of their Muslim faith. And what's interesting is that what you might hear with darbukas in the background and kompang and frame drums accompanying these singers, you might think this is, very Islamic and very local to Southeast Asia. But actually the tune is a tune of a theme song of a Bollywood movie called City Lights. You can see the poster here, which transient workers such as Ning Jihan, who was the first singer that you saw, had learned and encountered through the internet, through YouTube, through her own networked life, which taps into really enjoying Bollywood videos in Indonesia. And bringing those cultures through digital mediation into her world of her playlists, and then bringing that in a different reiteration into the worlds of this sacred soundings, if you like. So it's a very interesting flow that a lot of people would not have come to expect in terms of what you think transient workers in Singapore might be listening to, or how they are so adept at using the back routes of technological highways and hacking systems, And one thing that I really learned with regards to my experience and learnings with transient workers in Singapore, where I'm doing some research, is how before the pandemic, they were already all very much au fait with various technologies, because those were the only few avenues that they could use to claim political, social, real space in Singapore. So, it's not just how they've already arrived pre-pandemic, knowing how to deal with fancy recording technology and apps such as Smule, and moving across, handling MP3s on their tiny mobile phones, as opposed to us handling Zoom and supercomputers and lots of gigs, knowing how to use these particular digital affordances within very marginal spaces is something that's very much part of a new way of thinking about the sounded internet. It's not just this example that I've played you, but how in the case of transient workers' sounded lives, a lot of them, for example, have to recommit themselves to Islam much more than they would have been as practitioners in Indonesia. I think the sense of their religious identities become especially heightened when they come to Singapore and find themselves in the minority. And there aren't that many mosques in Singapore, which is pretty much Chinese dominant territory. And when there are mosques, you don't really hear the call to prayer, the adhan. So even if you do hear it, it's probably not broadcast really loud. And there's a separate paper on this I can go into. But what's interesting is that a lot of these migrant workers have learned how to download adhan apps, as you can see here, except that in the households that they're working in, that's where the so-called interesting affective labor and affective leisure comes into play. They sometimes self-censor and don't want to turn on the mobile phones that will play these apps for them because they're afraid of how they might come across to their employers. So they actually put these apps on vibration mode. But what's really interesting is that a lot of these migrant workers wait to hear the vibration of their mobile phones. So they have discovered a new way of listening to not just the adhan and not just listening to faith, but listening to technology as a result of all these very complex machinations of, political agency or lack of, as well as technological affordance, riding on the high-speed internet connections that their employers in these homes where they live in and work in also give them. So this is very interesting in terms of the back roots of technology and what it might provide for the migrant workers, and who also use and bring in affective leisure into affective labor. There's another example that I can speak about, which is related to the Islamic chant that you heard earlier on. So how do these workers actually learn? A lot of them actually are sent on to YouTube links to learn the songs via the internet. At other points in time, they send recordings to each other and circulate these recordings via WhatsApp, and they are listened to by a tutor who gives them feedback, and so these two screen grabs here show you how things are done. And migrant workers are constantly, even as they are in the same room together, learning and listening and sounding to each other, they're also on their phones recording and also sending MP3 files. So there's this very interesting presence of technology alongside live performance and live music making in the little slivers of leisure time that can be reclaimed from work time and labor. That is very, very interesting for me anyway, in terms of what I can say about hidden musical flows in the age of digital affordances that we take for granted as well as not take for granted. So that's one quick case study to look at before we move on to another example, which is how other kinds of hidden musical flows, for example, not flows between the so-called West versus East or the global North versus the global South, but rather places outside the West where there are different kind of cross-cultural inequalities. And one good example is K-pop and K-pop's appropriation and borrowing largely through digital musical flows. It's appropriation of Black culture in its articulations and expressions. And it wasn't until very recently that when K-pop has now become a phenomenon around the world and noticed in North America itself, and also by the marginalized communities in the Black world, that new debates about Black culture being appropriated and used and maybe even abused by K-pop stars and K-pop industries and K-pop agents, these new debates have come into being and are being facilitated via the internet as well, where some people might actually say it was because of digital technologies that these flows between Korea and Black culture in North America have been born in the first place. But the rise of K-pop fans on the internet have brought into the public eye issues of the appropriation of Black culture by East Asia. East Asian agents, and also how K-pop fans are weaponizing the internet for important movements such as Black Lives Matter. So this is another example of what I think is a very interesting musical flow that isn't just rooted in one, specific community of migrant workers that zoom out into the broader context of Southeast Asia as well as South Asia. But now we're looking at, different intercontinental flows that are hidden, or maybe not so hidden if you think about it. It's just that we've not been opening our eyes or opening our ears to them. So that's another example. A third example is to consider the counter discourse, the view from China. So if you look at more statistics and pie charts, most of the content languages for websites around the world today are in English. That's 59%. But the actual users, internet users by language, the single biggest group is actually Chinese in China and in the Chinese diaspora. And what does this say about the assumptions we've made with regards to digital technology and musical technologies? So I mentioned that you can't get Spotify in China. So what do you get in China? Well, compared to the 345 million subscribers of Spotify, you have 298.74 alone for Tencent Music provided by Google, and 243.54. I mean, all the single top streaming provider in China is so much bigger than the market share of Spotify in one entire continent, which really gives you, the chance to reappreciate the kind of difference in scales of technologies or affordances of technologies and approaches to how we think about technology and music consumption is happening. And this is just Spotify. This is just one example. There's so many other, or music streaming. This is just one example. There's so many other ways of trying to understand hidden musical flows. So just to give you a little bit of background, even the way we use the internet is very, very different. Apart from Google, QQ Music, Google Player, and NetEase, which are the biggest streamers in China, a lot of music is shared in China through this equivalent of YouTube, which is called Bilibili.com. But in order to get onto Bilibili.com and get an account and sign up to one, you either have to be referred by a person, or if you're a person outside of China like myself, you have to take an exam of many questions and pass at least 66% of them. And these questions are not easy questions. They're questions on netiquette, on geography, on general knowledge and understanding of Chinese legislation, as well as copyright law. So some of these exam questions that you have to take are actually quite funny. For example, this one is, the question is asking, the screen has gone very black. What are you going to do? And the multiple choice answers are A, don't do anything, just enjoy the darkness. B, turn off your lights. C, complain to the authorities. And D, adjust your saturation and your lightness, brightness control levels. And that's just one example of an exam question, which I hopefully got right. Although I probably, maybe I got this wrong. This was a question about copyright and what author's right really refer to. I definitely got this wrong because it was a question on sea levels and circumference of the Earth. I got this one wrong as well, which was to state the height of one of China's top models for Victoria's Secrets, Li Wen, which I did not know. And, to show you how specifically tapped into global digital cultural flows China is, one of the questions was, which of the following is a curse? So I think I did get this right, but it goes to show how the internet is used in China in completely different ways, just in terms of a technological baseline, but also very, very globalized, just not in the ways we expect. And one thing that I wanted to talk about is how, we take for granted a lot of things with regards to how music is consumed and what is available. But YouTube is banned in China. Google is banned in China. There's a whole state setup of many, many different mechanisms for music sharing, not just digitally, but live music as well. And it's not necessarily the Great Wall which shuts off the rest of the world, but how people also know how to use other kinds of bespoke hacker technologies in the same way that the transient workers had done to climb over the Great Wall. So there's an example of the grass mud horse controversy, which I was hoping to share with you. Probably not enough time. You can go look it up. It deals with censorship. And also how musical flows and in the Chinese diaspora have interacted in plain sight and have been hiding in plain sight through the provision of joke videos and parody videos, and how things, the parallel conversations going on with regards to politics in China, but how music is also very much part of that and sometimes can be used as a camouflage. Okay, that was a little bit of a detour, but in the interest of time, I want to let us think about technologies in different contexts, and how we are always talking about technology and data harvesting via musical programs and how musical apps, and how privacy and surveillance are the new hot topics that seem to be at the forefront of debates around technological frontiers. And when we talk about all of this, I think it's also important to point out that surveillance is not just a Chinese problem. It's a problem that, was obviously one which all of us who had a Facebook account had to deal with, in terms of the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook debacle of several years ago, as well as the simple fact that your ISP provider already knows pretty much all the internet sites you've been visiting. So I think, amidst all this talk about technological frontiers and fears of data harvesting, bias in code, bias in data, and extremization of search results, and where sound comes into this, I think we have to realize that we're living in a world where it's not just a problem of a particular territory, but it's a broader human problem. And when we're thinking about human problems and having anxieties over algocracy, maybe it's not such a new problem after all, because at the end of the day, the people who write code are human beings. And the internet, maybe, the so-called false sense of democracy provided by the internet is really an old problem of power structures, where ultimately internet is subject to neoliberal forces and the governing crowd behavior of human beings, citing Elias Canetti here. So I would like to, quickly move from alternative views of China to think about counter discourse number 3. How do we think about post-digitality, post-humanity, and global inequalities, not just in terms of human, but also broader environmental impact? I'd like to invite you to think about what's happening today. What is the cost of Zoom concerts, MS Teams conferences? We're saving on airfares and venue hire, but what exactly is the cost of video streaming and massive server costs? Now, if you were to visit this website here, you can copy and paste later. You will find that actually sound is, and audio only is, a very important way of lowering your carbon footprint. which makes one rethink the way we communicate. So I'm still putting my video on here, and probably some of you have turned off your video screens, but maybe this commitment to lowering our carbon footprint might allow us to rethink the way we listen, to rethink the way we communicate via the internet, but use audio-only facilitations. So maybe that's one thing to think about in terms of a different kind of hidden musical flow. Another thing that we can think about is the relative environmental impact of acoustic versus electronic instruments, and how we make peace or not with the durability of the things that we use, Stradivari violins versus cheap guitars, or electronic music instruments that we constantly need to upgrade and get newer versions of, or do we just sort of hang on to them and add and upgrade in terms of add-ons instead of getting rid of old synthesizers, throwing them away and bringing in new ones. So that's another thing that I think is a different kind of digital frontier we can think about, even at the same time that, you know, we realize large parts of sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to the internet in the same way that we have, never mind fancy electronic instruments, but at the same time are able to use the hacked highways via very basic apps on phones to do very complicated and very fascinating things, sound-wise and music-wise. At the end of the day, I'm going to wrap up by posing this question, that maybe the question of hidden musical flows and digital inequalities and how all of this comes together is not one of music versus technology or arts versus sciences, but a question that has to be solved through asking more of politics, and how really at the end of the day, it is the political forces that determine who gets what and who gets how much internet, and where music and sound come into play in the exchanges and the especially intersectional ways in which we can think about scale of music making, music listening, music appreciation, or sound for that matter. It is really a question of who has power and who has the money that comes with the power. So on this note, thank you for listening. Sorry for taking up 7 minutes more of your time. And I'm very happy to wait for questions. Thank you.
The second presenter of the panel, Hidden Flows, is Anjeline De Dios, a writer, vocal performer, and teacher whose multidisciplinary practice explores the intersections of spatiality, culture, labor, and listening. She finished her PhD in geography at the National University of Singapore, and she is also a co-editor of the Algar Handbook on the Geographies of Creativity, published in 2020. At present, she's a strategic researcher and a critical thinking friend at Dark Matter Labs, and her presentation's title is Not That Black, Not That White, the Migrant Filipino Labor of Live Music in Asia. And don't forget that after Angelina's presentation, the two panelists will have a discussion together and a Q&A with the public. So once again, whenever you have a question or you like to add something to the conversation, please feel free to do that either on YouTube or on Discord, and we are going to forward those questions to the panelists. But before we do that, let's watch Angelina's presentation.
Hi, everybody. Good morning from Manila. I'm really happy to be here today. Technically the future. Today is January 25, but I'll be talking to you, hearing your thoughts on January 30. So I'm happy to be in the future talking about my past, basically the last 10 years of my PhD research work and subsequent sharing of this work through various fora, various little pieces of texts, and an ongoing manuscript process, bringing to the table some hopefully fresh questions insofar as we learn different kinds of freshness as we stick to something for maybe a little longer than we anticipated. And then using the time here, the next 29 minutes or so, to introduce, like I said, these fresh questions to a really fascinating conversation I'm honored to be a part of for the CTM Discourse series. The title of my talk today is Not That Black, Not That White, Overseas Filipino Musicians in the Work of Live Music. I take the title from a quote I did in one of the 70 or so interviews I did with migrant Filipino musicians in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and the home cities of Manila and Cebu. I find myself circling back to this quote over and over again from a very perceptive pianist, guitarist, band leader who had worked in India. I met him at the time in Singapore and is at present back in the Philippines, running multiple businesses and I think still performing from time to time. In short, this is a guy with a lot of experience who's had a lot of time to think from those different experiences about this persistent, even stubborn question that has hounded me for the last 10 years. Every time I speak to either a non-musician or a non-Filipino about this phenomenon I'm studying, the proliferation of Filipino citizens working as live musicians in all manner of leisure venues, mainly throughout Asia. Why are there so many Filipino musicians is that pesky question I keep having to address. Specifically, many of them wonder, why are there so many Filipino musicians with the subtext of, and why are they not performing their own music? Why are they not singing Filipino music? If they're so good, why are they imitating all the time? So most of the work that I've done in the last 10 years was to flip this question around from finding causes in some fixed essentialist notion of Filipino-ness, whether this is a national, racial, some sort of cultural, institutional identity. I flip that question around mainly because whenever I post this question to actual Filipino musicians, the majority of them brush the question off almost with a kind of laughing irritation. Only this guy told me that there was something really important in the way Filipino musicians are raised a certain way. They are not that black and not that white. And so inspired by answers such as that one, I pursued a reversed version of that pesky question. Why instead does live music, whether it's an economy, an industry, an aspiration even, and certainly an option, a career option, why does it draw a certain kind of musician who happens to be Filipino? And what does Filipino mean, in effect? Those of you who have gone to hotels or cruise ships or ever sat in a lobby or in a club will know that in Asia at least, and it's a big at least, there are musicians who perform, first of all, the predominant impression is that these are highly skilled, talented musicians with a flair for capturing a remembered soundscape of popular music, like album quality. And the second thing is that, as the opening quote described so succinctly, they're not black and they're not white either. Yet they couldn't sound black or white, thanks to the finesse and fidelity with which they entertain us. So that's a word that I'll be coming to a lot. Entertainment. And my research and the work of many other exemplary scholars, ethnomusicologists, geographers, historians, Philippine studies experts, what all of us have encountered is a long colonial history of Filipinos entertaining specifically international colonial audiences, military clubs, churches, police bands, choirs, schools, even royalty, as teachers, performers, a whole conglomerate, a whole assemblage of musical roles from teaching to provision. I've been toggling back and forth between these two pictures of musicians in different eras, still with the same profile of being migrant Filipinos. Of course, a secondary, I would say a secondary, but important dimension is that they are all adult men. And of a certain kind, they're instrument players. As far as we can tell from the two photos, there are no vocalists. These are granular differences that also matter in shaping the whole story. And I would say that this picture taken in 2013 is very different, yet similar to this picture taken in 1926 and published in the Philippines Free Press during the American colonial period, where publications were being circulated in a variety of languages, certainly more diverse than current day Philippines, I'd say. So this was a Spanish language broadsheet, which was dominant at the time of the second or third decade of the American colonial period in the Philippines. And already there was a construction of these musicians as musicians and as colonial subjects that were grouped under the name of Filipinos. And they weren't just any kind of musician or just any kind of Filipino, they were jazzistas Filipinos. And what were they doing? Performing a very conspicuously colonial way of domination. They invaded and conquered Tokyo with the power of their talent to perform jazz music. So this is, of course, very different from this picture of the brothers in the cruise ship which left Penang, Malaysia, and circulated around the islands, the neighboring Thai islands of Phuket. And yet they are still doing a combination of Western skilled music and doing essentially the same thing, which is entertaining, creating space where people want to stay. So there is, with these two pictures, I'm gesturing towards a much longer and enduring structural phenomenon, I guess you could say, that is best understood as a constellation of seemingly different concepts or concerns. There is the question of racial, national, ethnic identity becoming a certain marker for value or expertise or reputation, even branding in a polyphonic and complex social space, which is the migrant diasporic international space. And then there is the concept of music as a form of artistic cultural production and of aliveness itself as a certain modality of art and of living, we will see very clearly. So that's the architecture, you could say, the basic architecture behind this research question I've been struggling with. Why does live music draw Filipino musicians? So bringing attention here to the structures, the infrastructures that create a certain figure, a certain job, a certain economy. And I've broken down my answer into 3 parts that I'll be skimming over in the last half of this talk today. Despite the systemic devaluation of Filipino-ness, of course, the more general process is that of imbuing value, narrative, meaning, and by inevitable entanglement, economic value, price, ranking, worth even. So this whole process cultural construction of evaluation. In the case of Filipino-ness, from the Spanish and American colonial periods more than 350 years ago to the present, that cultural process of Filipino-ness is a devaluation. It is a question of being subordinated, marginalized, exploited, yes, and so often misunderstood. So this devaluation of Filipino-ness is systemic, and yet, we see how much of it doesn't matter to scores of Filipino musicians, and by extension, their employers, their families, from encouraging them to do it, their audience members, their colleagues who are not Filipino, and a whole host of other social relationships actively support and benefit from this systemic position. And it's a lot more complicated than plain good, 100% good, or 100% bad. So there is that systemic devaluation, and despite it, there exists a complex life system, ecosystem. And we'll be digging into some of those stories, some of the people or beings who inhabit and actively produce, in some sense, that ecosystem. And why do they do that? We go to parts 2 and 3 of what feels like a 3-part story. So despite this problematic positioning, work in live music recognizes live music as work. It's a distinct form of labor. It does something, it provides something valuable that is so valuable that it has persisted as a form of work ever since colonial times, we could say. So that goes back to the 2 pictures I've been showing you of the cruise ship trio and the Jazzistas Filipinos, each embodying, providing, creating an experience of modernity. We could put it in no modest terms. Experiences of modernity, globalization, popular culture, and the affective outcomes of that music, which is somehow being in a now that is exciting, that is pleasurable, that is entertaining. There is work involved there, and work in live music puts that distinctive cachet of skills and competencies front and center. Finally, live music draws Filipino musicians because it's a form of work that can last for decades, as some respondents I've spoken to have been live musicians for over 30 years. It endures as something valuable and something worth sticking to because it affords certain ways to live together. It affords certain outcomes of community, belonging, most important word, of self-worth and self-value by participating in a larger we. Let me go through these pieces one by one. Whenever we're talking about evaluation and the evaluation of musical labor, we typically resort to 2 major framings: the framing of authenticity, or the trope or discourse of authenticity, and in recent decades, with the rise of the creativity dispositif, originality. I would say that innovation is a 3rd trope that we're not necessarily counting as unimportant but irrelevant to this particular economy, which is essentially conservative because it is about the reproduction of music that's already gained a certain level of common experience of value. It's popular. As we know, popular music as it's developed in the 20th century and into its 21st century is premised on the whole project of colonial globalization and modernization, centering Western mainstream music, modes, styles, and all the way to appearance as the paradigmatic ideal to which everybody else who does not belong to that epicenter of local music production in the US and the UK, and there were several metropoles that were important in the initial emanation of pop rock forms. We know that this economy thereby creates a hierarchy of value where you are assessed by others and self-assess through a measurement of authenticity. Now, we'll get into the registers of authenticity, like what makes something authentic in just a minute. But just to say, for non-Western musical forms, authenticity has often been the register by which cultural producers and practices and products, we could say, are ranked or even constructed as personalities or products. So right away we see that the market for live music does away with authenticity because it puts front and center the act of reproducing. Just a second ago, I was talking about how authenticity serves as a way for us to measure each other based on who we perceive the other and the self to be. It's very similar logic to a more familiar language or discourse of evaluation and mutual relationship, mutual perception, which is the language of branding. This was invoked spontaneously by my respondents, such as this one, Fernan, who came up with that previous quote about Filipino musicians being not that black and not that white, and how from the register or value hierarchy of authenticity automatically places them at the bottom of the pyramid. Then Fernan goes on to say how this branding of devaluation is only half of the story. Filipinos are cheapest but better than most. You'll see here from the quote that this notion of being cheaper but better than most is profoundly comparative. And that's how identity works. Let's unpack how identity works as it's being demonstrated in this quote by Fernan. So this is a diagram I'm proposing to try to make sense of how identity as a brand, meaning it's a discourse that's activated in certain communities and economies of practice, transaction, profession. I'm focusing, it's been very helpful for me to locate music and cultural production as a labor economy because it surfaces these other issues that we're not maybe so used to using when we think about the worth and the work of music. So these are just some of the major registers or conceptual frameworks that commonly surface, not just in cultural production and music, but perhaps even music plus other labor economies. So we know that some comparative value registers that create a script for identity branding are embodied, meaning they're related to the material corporeal realities of being a social being, such as disability, gender and sexuality, and even I would say this notion of a gift, this notion of musical genius, which we find, personally at least, I find very difficult to talk about in a critical way. But we need to when we talk about music, because as in any other music economy, there are fantastically gifted people who happen to be Filipinos, who then, because of their Filipino-ness, have to contend with other value registers, such as the inescapable ones of race, ethnicity, nationality, and even region or civilization. This comes up in everyday parlance when the Filipino musicians I talk to, in a conspiratorial way, will invoke our common Filipino-ness to distinguish ourselves from a non-Filipino who is a Westerner, who is a white person. It helps to have this parsing of terms when I map onto the other more specific diagram, but at least I wanted to show how this could work out or play out in any number of contexts and economies. I've taken, as I've said, some of the more general ones, the classic race, gender, class trio, some more specific ones such as gift, musical experience, discipline, not just in the sense of what instrument, what vocal style you're trained in. And this, I would quickly say, has a relation or a resemblance to disciplinary boundaries that we academics and art workers adhere to, right, as our identity and as our subsequent brand, because that's what we put in our LinkedIn profiles, for instance. And then I've put some more kind of amorphous categories that show up in a very relevant way when we start talking about the creative industries. So your professional network, the school, the educational pathway that you've come from, like I've said, the practical professional experience as a musician, which can be further elaborated on when we look at family biography or school networks. So they're all intertwined, and yet it's a little useful to map out their own little spots on the diagram. But then when we look at Filipinos themselves as a kind of musician functioning and thus being evaluated in a distinctly international context, I found it useful to summon this little basket, or gather this little basket of Filipino terms that came up quite organically in my interviews, which tie together some of the categories I showed in the previous slide. So when a Filipino talks about lahi and lahing Pilipino, we're not necessarily just referring to the passport that we hold or the ancestry of our parents and grandparents, but again in a concept that's been developed and deconstructed and complicated usefully by many other scholars in different disciplines. It's an imaginative community that is tied to tangible and material, one would say even corporeal, register of self-identification, which is that of blood. You also have the related terms of galing and galing. Galing, here in the bottom, refers to literally where you've come from. And depending who you're talking to, whether you're talking to another Filipino from another region, for instance, or another school, or another family, or if you're talking to a Filipino and maybe a saxophonist from New Zealand, then the scales of discernibility of pinanggalingan, where you came from, can occupy this whole spectrum of categories. You know, it can be your nationality, it can be your hometown, it can be your province, which is quite significant in the case of Filipino musicians because it gives, the province where you come from gives a lot of salient information about, for instance, what's your primary language, for instance, who your teachers or your usual bandmates are, especially if there are provincial cliques in big Filipino migrant destinations such as Hong Kong. So that's galing, where you've come from. And then there is a related but different term called galing. So it's spelled the same, but the accent is different. And galing refers to that notion of gift that I was hinting at in the previous slide. But in the Filipino understanding of galing, your gift, your natural God-given talent, can only be relevant if it is continually practiced, shared, exercised, promoted, improved. So it brings together usefully, I feel, notions of what is inherent and what is created or constructed through practice. The last, of course, I don't have much time. I need to wrap up. The last major Filipino conceptual category that was taught to me in a way by my respondents is that of halaga. And halaga literally means importance. And in the Filipino language, it's used in a quite fascinating array of ways. You use halaga to talk about the literal monetary value of something. It's not the same as expensive, which is mahal. Interestingly, mahal means both love and expensive. Related concept, but different. We're looking here at halaga. Halaga is also used to talk about worth. Yeah. So there is halaga to a Filipino musician because of galing, because of the skill or the talent, the gift that they bring. I would also say because of their trabajo. Trabajo, of course, coming from the Spanish word work, but here in a specific context of migrant Filipino workers, it refers to the kind of job you have, whether in this huge multi-sector migrant economy of Filipinos, you're a domestic worker, a nurse, a musician, a chef, a professor, brings certain connotations of class and position. So because of the work that they do, they are good, but because they're cheap, they don't occupy a very high position. So the example that I give of this artist named Gail, who used to be one of the top recording musical theater mainstream celebrity singers. Well, actually, she wasn't a celebrity, but she was a great, well-respected singer. She had the luxury to move to Hong Kong and then to occupy a lead artist role in a theme park there. And she was also selected as a lead artist for a cruise ship, which is a position not typically given to non-Americans. So we're seeing here the interplay of lahi, trabajo, and pinanggalingan, your citizenship. So she locates a lot of halaga or value in overseas Filipino musicians' ability to deliver the goods, basically. And by delivering the goods, I'm hinting here at a third value hierarchy, which is not originality nor authenticity, but is flexibility. So the ability to say yes is seen as both a competency and a liability. I'll explain that in a little minute. But for now, I want to point out how flexibility, which I'm proposing as a third value hierarchy that operationalizes racialization in the live music sector a certain way, very clearly in the case of Filipino musicians, the ability to say yes is premised on several registers of identity and practice. So the problem with learning how to say no or being unable to say no is a function, as Charlie points out, as a structural liability, where Filipinos are not local musicians who can look for other jobs in their own country, or white and black Westerners, whether they're from Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the US, South Africa as well, are frequently cited. And they benefit from the overarching hierarchy of authenticity that places whiteness and blackness as primary registers for musical value. because Filipinos are shut out of that hierarchy or placed at the bottom of it, they need to always say yes because they are, by virtue of their branding as Filipinos and as migrant Filipinos, they don't have as much mobility in this labor economy. Mobility to change jobs and mobility to bargain the terms of their payment, as we saw in the example of Cerise. And yet, this flexibility hierarchy, of which Filipinos have kind of dominated the cultural and the economic imagination for live music, you'll see that Gail here insists on reading the value of flexibility in a positive way as well. And we know that this is a hallmark of any kind of value. It works as a plus or as a minus, frequently at the same time. So she reads flexibility in terms of the dignity and perseverance, and resilience is another big term that's always frequently racialized as Filipino. That in such conditions of systemic valuation, there is a certain notion of galing, competence.
Hello. Welcome back to this space. I don't know, Angeline, is this how to pronounce your name? Is it Anjeline or Angeline?
They all sound nice actually, but most people stick with Angeline.
Angeline, I don't know if it was my video, but I missed the last sentence you were talking about.
Don't worry, it's not you. It was totally the really laggy and spotty internet. So I want to apologize for that over here. Now that we're on January 30, January 25, me was in a very stressed out place because of that spotty internet connection.
I knew that would be a digital glitch, and we're just going to lean into it, which I find really fascinating. There's also an audio-visual lagging as well, which I think really shows up all the different unequal and asymmetrical flows we're talking about. Did you want to round up your paper? Because I sort of felt that it's just sort of ended with the word competent, which is the last word I heard.
Yeah. How do I do this? I think what I wanted to leave off of in the talk was just to highlight that the strange reality, of course, is that in this international market for live performance, they tend to follow these boundaries of race and nationality. In very similar ways to the recorded music industry. I think you were also hinting at that a little bit in the politics of appropriation in K-pop music. But rather that, just as they're reinforcing these notions of difference and this whole basic notion of the aesthetic content and the aesthetic style of music directly should map onto this essentialized racial identity, and then it kind of circulates because the more you perform the music and lean into that essentialized notion of what it is to be like a Black American music or a Korean or traditional Korean singer, then there also happens these very interesting cracks and contradictory ways of counter listening, which I thought was so beautifully captured in the story that you gave about the Indonesian migrant workers, very seamlessly blending and taking as natural different sources and ways of consuming and producing music, no matter where it comes from geographically. And that's precisely the entire notion of the live music economy, because you have these musicians performing in hotels, in cruise ships, in theme parks like Disneyland. And what I think is quite remarkable about Filipinos is that in spite and yet also because of this attachment that we all have, that to originality and authenticity of music, they're everywhere. And the fact of their being able to imitate is usually read in these terms that, you know, is there like a Filipino thing for imitating music, and then there's always this sense of melancholy, but don't you produce your own music? Which is really funny for me as a musician myself, because just like any music economy, you have people who do covers and you have people who do originals. And when you get on the ground, just like the listeners in these Indonesian Muslim spaces in Singapore, you see them very easily kind of crossing these boundaries. Yeah, I think I'll just end there and open it up for a chat, because I find that there are so many kind of strange parallels and the precarity and kind of this existential status of where live music is now, especially since there's this long suspension of gathering in COVID.
Yeah, totally. We would like to open up the floor for questions, but while you are members of the audience or other members of the panel would like to pose questions to us, I have so many that I would love to discuss with Anjeline. And one thing is the notion of hidden in musical flows. So I think both our papers have dealt with alternative discourses of listening, of music production, of live musicking, of digital music production. But what is the alternative to the alternative, and what exactly is hidden? Because really, from whose perspective are we talking about hidden? From the Filipino musicians' perspective, they're there. And the thing is, everyone has gone to a hotel and listened to a lounge musician, but do we, take them as real musicians in our, professional sub-disciplinary ranking system and all these hierarchies? Is it us who's choosing to see certain categories and classes of musicians as hidden? That's one thing. And how does this so-called flow, as opposed to a center of production, map up in new ways of thinking about listening? I mean, I think we're living in a time, especially post Black Lives Matter, when everyone is talking about the other discourse, or East versus West, or global North versus global South. And there's this urge to decolonize and recenter, which I've always been committed to, but, it's not new. Koichi Iwabuchi has been saying this for a very long time. Chen Guanxing has been saying this like 20, 30 years ago, and we go all the way back to Walter Mignolo as well. But I'm also encountering a lot of discourses about how if you decentralize or you find a new center, you end up creating yet another canon, which is very problematic. So the thinking has moved towards circulations and flows, which I think is very important parts of Angeline's paper. It's about flows, but even within the structure of flows, whether you call them transnational flows or transcultural or transgenre flows, there is still political structure at work and political inequalities, in most of the time race-based, or even if it's economic, it's political, economic, and race-based, I feel, at this moment. So how do we reconcile this need to decolonize and to post-decolonize with, all these structural inequalities of flows as circulatory, recirculatory, and flows within flows? Sorry, it sounds a bit abstract, but I think the rich examples that Anjeline talks about really shows us and grounds us.
Yeah. That's a whole 5-hour discussion, I think. Right? I'm really taken by how you're posing this charge to us about interrogating for whom is the hidden flow hidden. I think for sure, one superficial layer to that is this is, as you've said, this historical shift and urgency for self-reflection in popular culture, but also especially in art and academia, around the project of decolonization and the realization of just how far we are from really taking it seriously. But on another layer, I find also that this hiddenness is also kind of built into um, um, the mystique of music and art itself, um, which is a far deeper. Well, it's also of course political, but then it has very deep roots that might not be so easy to spell out in terms of racial or economic inequalities in cultural production. And why I say this is I'm thinking very specifically of this sense of resentment that a lot of my Filipino respondents shared, and because I also hang out with musicians outside the research, I was struck by a similarity that I was hearing, and this was the resentment that they frequently voiced. They said that they don't recognize music, they don't dignify. People don't understand, one, how difficult music is, and then two, they don't know how to value music. Is it because we have this persistent assumption that art and music and the work of art and music are play, something we do for fun? And is it also because there's all this strange paradoxical devaluation that happens when we think that music and art are outside somehow the ordinary realms of work and wages? So it's somehow elevated and put down at the same time. And that makes it very hard for people to understand the real economics and the whole labor dynamics. For instance, any freelance musician or artist or cultural worker, which is probably all of us, and a lot of people watching too, will understand that how many times have we heard our graphic designer friend complain when a client very blithely asks them to come up with a design the next day, thinking that it's easy. What I find very interesting with the work of liveness in particular, and this is something that live musicians have in common with theater actors, with any kind of people who, or dancers, any kind of artist that works with liveness as a medium, is that third layer, the hiddenness, has to be intentional. They many of my musicians spoke of authenticity not in terms of racial fidelity, like I'm a Black American, so I'm going to sing Aretha Franklin or Whitney Houston, but in terms of I need to regulate my emotions. So there's this affective, this might be the flip side of your affective leisure thesis, right? That I have to perform this affective labor, that if I'm angry or I'm worried because my mother back in the Philippines is sick and my siblings aren't helping pay for the hospital bills, I have to show a different face because the music I'm playing is supposed to relax and entertain the audience in the hotel. So I'm seeing these three of possibly infinite layers of hiddenness that I think is really important, as you said, to interrogate. Yeah.
That is so inspiring. I mean, speaking of affective leisure, I also wonder where one puts, religion and spiritual expressions. Yes. Is it work or is it fun? It's not necessarily fun, but I wanted to pick up on your point about the valuing of musical labor internationally, globally, transnationally, and how that intersects with other kinds of politics of class, gender, and race. I mean, I was just, typical cocktail party situation. I go to a cocktail party, there's a lawyer, there's a doctor, and there's me. And then they find out what we do, and they're like, "Oh, you're a musician. Can you play the piano for us? Can you sing for us?" And I'm like, "Oh, you're a doctor. Can you tell me what's wrong with my back? Oh, you're a lawyer. Can you give me some, free consultation on my whatever job contract?" Right? Nobody ever asks lawyers or doctors these questions, but they will ask musicians and dancers and all that. And I think the kind of hierarchized value or devaluing of arts labor and performing arts labor is very interesting when it conflates with class. I was just thinking about your example of Filipino musicians as a kind of stereotyped other in urban context all across the world, nationally within China, how the minority nationalities
are forced to seek recourse like in theme parks, as you say. It seems to be the only thing that they can do, handicrafts or singing and dancing. There's even a Chinese phrase 能歌善舞 to describe like particular situations of the minority nationalities, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, like you say, it's been legitimized in other ways, and you're brought to the, you know, the highest end of the hierarchy if you come from a so for example, in China, in, you know, pre-modern China, if you wanted to be a musician of proper repute, you had to do it for free. You couldn't do it for work. You had to be a rich man who played the tin by the moonlight, and you will play the zither and drink some wine and gather with friends. You know, it's like the landed gentry enjoying literature, and you do this for free, and it's the mark of highest self-cultivation. But I was also thinking about Black musicians in North America. The very first instances in which Black people could you know, appear in the public sphere was as musicians. And I think it's so important how music affords that platform. Like you say, there's some kind of mystique, but at the same time, they appeared as musicians and in the public sphere at the bottom end of the kind of structural political economic ladder. So it sort of makes you think about the conflation of class and sometimes non-conflation of class with race and musical labor. That is so fascinating when it works in different ways. You know, in China, the legitimization is completely different to, let's say, in North America, for the positionality of someone who is someone who lives in the margins, who's a minority. And I think the whole intersectional approach really, to me, appears to be the way forward to try to unpick all these different asymmetries and looking at specific cases. But speaking of looking and listening, you know, I was thinking about the notion of hidden. I feel that it's hidden in plain sight. It's just that we choose to ignore it. And that's because of all sorts of biases at work. And looking at paths forward, how can we unsee or re-see or unlisten or re-listen? I don't know if you have any ideas. And I'm also, you know, thinking about this very festival, which, you know, it's being held in Berlin, right? Except that I'm in London and you're in Manila. We're in different time zones, different time spaces. And we are two Southeast Asian people. I suppose I've got Chinese privilege in Southeast Asia, but I don't have that in the UK. We're talking to each other. And then I'm living in a Brexit divided UK, you know, where notions of belonging to Europe or not it permeates every single thing, whether I can find pears in a supermarket as opposed to chicken adobo in my Asian supermarket. You know, it's very interesting. And I was just thinking about our hosts, you know, at the CTM festival, who have been organizing this festival for like close to 30 years, and the kind of trajectory of understanding cultural discourses that I feel all these discourses are kind of meshing on Zoom in a way that in itself is also a particular kind of digital affordance. Sorry, all this is a bit rambly, but maybe that's how it has to be. You have to lean into this.
These are really beautiful thoughts. Thanks. You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how difficult it is to conceive of flows without also conjuring up the opposite concept of boundaries, of places of stuckness, whether voluntary or involuntary. Yeah, I feel that why CTM as a festival is so inspiring is because I think they're managing to create this very graceful balance, I would say, between opening in kind of being transgressive with, you know, having like scholarly discourse along with contemporary art festivals, along with, you know, all sorts of different events, and curating it very carefully so that they flow into each other, yet you know, they still have these distinct purposes and their distinct dynamics per event. So shout out to the CTM team for that. And I feel that you know, not to pat ourselves on the back or anything, but also like a well-deserved pat. I think the work really starts from as you said, unlistening to re-listening. I think the unlistening part is the recognition that our projects of decolonization and intersectionality are still locally and provincially rooted in US and European Anglophone contexts. And it's people who are diasporic by choice or by chance, as all sorts of migrants, whether they're and I want to loop back to your point about class, because that's another part of the story, right? Different striations of class create different flows, depending on the kinds of boundaries that they have to transgress or work around. So I'm very inspired, for instance, by the kinds of cosmopolitanisms that working class migrants have, which are very, very different from the kind of supposed cosmopolitanism that people in white collar jobs or expats have. So I think that you and I and many other people, from not necessarily from economics or political science, but from sort of fluffier humanities and arts-based disciplines, have a very unique purchase on seeing just how these flows and barriers interact, because they're all jumbled up in cultural practices. I keep circling back to that image in that short clip you shared of these Indonesian domestic workers kind of carving their own schools, basically their own rehearsal studios, through the mediations of these apps. And I found myself kind of wondering, like, how does that, and I'll pose this question to you, how does it change their own relationship with home? Because that's kind of like another, that's another iteration of flow. Like, how does it change is it just like the Filipino musicians that I speak to who become musicians because they want to go abroad? So they form their kind of musical identity in a way inside these very restrained spaces of curtailment, which makes you kind of marvel sometimes at the kind of irrepressible creativity that is afforded by getting in touch with a sort of musical practice, no matter how racialized or curtailed it is. How is it for those Indonesian workers? Like, do they bring their musical selves back to Indonesia?
For sure. I mean, that's the short answer. But I'm so glad you asked this question. It's so layered. First of all, I'm just about to begin on the second part of a project on the sounded lives of migrant workers. So I also work with Filipino musicians, and I'd love to tap your brain even more. But with regards to the Indonesian workers, sometimes I ask them, what is your sound of home? What do you miss most when you are in Singapore? And some people have been there 3 years in Singapore, some have been there for 10 years, some for 17 years. And their answers are really interesting. So at first I thought they would talk about dangdut or, Indonesian pop stars, or their local gamelan, which is what I learned in school, right? Oh, in Indonesia, everyone plays the gamelan, that sort of thing, which is my bias. But they talk about K-pop and Bollywood. And then when I say, what about the sound? And, when a lot of people think about Indonesia, the first thing that they'll think is the capital city of Jakarta. And they don't realize, in Singapore, my perspective, that the journey of a migrant worker begins from very often a village going to the city of Jakarta. And Jakarta is in Indonesia, but it's not home. So, it's not a national boundary. It's actually an urban-rural boundary that I had not really thought about, whereas people just say Indonesia, Singapore, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and the sound of Hong Kong versus the sound of whatever. But Indonesia is so huge. It's got, anyway, I don't have to tell you about the geography of how many hundreds and thousands of islands. But there you go. It's sort of creates a different kind of relationality. And then like you're talking about the cosmopolitanisms of their working class, so important and so interesting how they re-intersect with experiences in Singapore. A lot of Indonesian workers end up watching a lot of K-dramas dubbed in Chinese and learning Chinese dialect alongside the K-dramas, and then bringing these sorts of expressions into their practice, as well as becoming a lot more religious. Like a lot of the workers that I know were not singing nasheed at all in Indonesia until they came to Singapore, and nasheed became their space. And going back to your point about music providing a particular kind of platform and affordance in physically claiming space. So before the pandemic, a lot of the Indonesian workers had to physically find a rehearsal space to practice together. But there are noise control issues and also a lot of self-censorship. Like they didn't want to come across as a public nuisance, which would create just even more problem with their work visas. So they have to find a place to rehearse in. But there are lots of public laws in Singapore that actually govern religious practice in a very regulated way. So these performers also, these Indonesian workers also think of music as not necessarily work or devotion, but as leisure, like you say, as something that nurtures their soul and allows people to meet up. So there are Indonesian workers who will go to Indonesian specific places like City Mall and do shopping and listen to the soundscape of like so many different dialects of Indonesia in that shopping center. There are others who just want to chill out and want to find a place that is air conditioned and like, there's so much noise around. I just want it to be really quiet. And one of the few spaces is the mosque. But the mosque cannot provide a kind of clubhouse for Indonesian workers, like it's a clubhouse. They have to say, they are having a music rehearsal. This is work, So how it becomes effective leisure becomes effective labor, and music. And it's not even music because it's not classified as music under Islamic law, right? As religious devotion, because music in some interpretations is not good for the spiritual soul. So what they're doing is religious devotion, which is a byword, a proxy for community building and just socialization, really. So when I talk about rehearsals, there are some moments where everyone is like very intense, but most of the time it's like chit chat, or I sing one bit, you sing one bit, and as with most rehearsals, so it's hard to draw the boundaries, between what is effective leisure, what's effective labor, how music offers this kind of very interesting physical staking of space in environment where Indonesian workers are very curtailed. And I find this so fascinating. And obviously the pandemic put a stop to all of this, but then a lot of workers have found their old spaces on Zoom, on Smule, on YouTube, on TikTok. They find new ways of making these spaces alive again and talking to each other. And WhatsApp is just so important. And the funny thing is they're using their employer's internet connection for this,
Yeah, burn the internet. Burn up that connection. I'm so glad that you brought up rehearsals, because I feel that still usefully actually circles back to this question, this provocative question and challenge you posed of how do we depart from sound and music to sharpen and to deepen our efforts to decolonize knowledge and life. And what I think is so unique about thinking about music rehearsals is because it places an emphasis on place, on practice, and on more embodied forms of mixing together and at the same time creating distinctions that this is a rehearsal, this is not a performance, this is religion, this is a religious activity, this is not frivolous music, but at the same time it is. So there's this liminality to music as embodiment that makes it very useful to look at in terms of how perhaps decolonization is already happening in these hidden ways. while you were speaking, I was reminded of some stories that I heard from musicians about how they and this doesn't just apply, I think, to the industry for live music in Asia, but in many different cultural sectors where you have more than, say, professional sectors. Here you have this greater variety of class, precisely because there's this dynamic of talent that comes into play, and that's not something you can train for. So what I noticed in these migrant spaces where there were lots of Filipino musicians, you had this wide range. They didn't fit one exact profile. You had people who didn't finish high school. You had people who studied abroad. You have people who learned how to play drums, borrowing the drum kit from their neighbor's house, or who learned how to play horns because they would hang out in their village's recreational hall, and then they would kind of borrow and pass instruments around. And then you had artists who, you know, went to formal music conservatories and were very kind of proud of that. And yet when they came into the rehearsal room, I'll never forget how one Filipino musician, kind of in Hong Kong, I asked her, you know, oh, what do you think of this ex-musician who comes from this really fancy, he came from Berkeley, he's played with this person and that person. And then my Filipino friend just made this face, and then she's like, you know what, he's not really that good. That was kind of, I was shocked. Because, and she was coming from a very specific world of how well are you able to improvise? How good-natured are you in taking unusual requests from the audience? If they ask for the same song like 5 times, you know, how able are you to control your temper? How fun are you to play with? That's a really important thing, which I think also comes up in the musical spaces of non-professional musicians, right? The music is better when the relationship is better. So it's not to say that it's simple and easy and fun all the time. In fact, because it's primarily affective and relational, decolonizing music is kind of more complicated in a way.
Yeah, you know, I wanted to pick up on this notion of decolonizing music and how you're saying it's already being decolonized, and how in a lot of recent talks I've given on decolonization, I recall one of my inspirations, the ethnomusicologist Tan Sui Beng from Malaysia, who said to me in a chat on social media, like, you know, all you people in North America and Europe, you're talking about decolonization like it's some fancy word, but we've been doing this our whole lives for like 50 years, you know, of her teaching career. I mean, and then suddenly you just call it decolonization. You know, this is already there, but it's just people who are just so well used to other kinds of mainstreams who refuse to see it. And it made me think about time lags, and it made me think about temporal asymmetries. And back to one of your earlier points at the beginning of your keynote speech, which I thought was so amazing, which you were saying, this is your past self speaking to your future self and a future audience. And it made me think about how I'm doing the opposite. I have like about 3 years backlog of papers that I haven't written. So I'm living in the past. My head is living in the past. But you know, on the broader theme of temporal asymmetries, I mean, this is going to be a recorded conversation. We're going to some people are going to catch up on this on YouTube, as I am with most of the CTM festival and other conferences that I bookmarked, and I'm going to go in the end, you never go, and then you kind of catch up on them much later and try to understand everything in a different timeline, in a different time zone. And how this is really fascinating in terms of, you know, even short-term histories, timelines and histories of thinking, and intergenerational responses. So I mentioned this apropos of my last comment in my paper on asymmetries and climate change, I sort of feel that we're having really, really important discussions right now on race, on decolonization, on decentering, even though they have been around for like 50 years, but now people are taking notice. But I also realize that the conversation tenor is also shifting towards debates about climate change. And I would like to really exhort people who are listening now to not forget how to intersect these two debates, not to let one debate take over the other. I mean, I'm seeing like more research grants being offered for music and environment, sound and environment, and then people forget about decolonization. But to try to remind us that decolonization still goes on into the age of climate change and all of that. I speak of this mainly because I feel that, so I'm Gen X, sorry, I'm an old person. Younger generations of not just scholars, but just 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds are so progressive. They use they, them pronouns. They know that racism is bad. They can talk about gender theory. But I think there's a disconnect between what they take for granted and what is happening in the reality, just as there's a disconnect in lounges, and we just disconnect from all of that in the way we think of them as real musicians. So the inequalities are still there, even though the wonderful academic theory is pushing you forward. I mean, I'm thinking of radical feminism, which is now part of any university program, and it's become something different. It's about personhood and all that, but there's still a gender pay gap. There's still not enough women musicians. Women musicians get paid less, so we can talk about all these wonderful discourses, and our heads are in the future, in a post-race world, I don't know, but our bodies are stuck in the past. I don't know where our minds are. I think my mind is probably I don't know, aspirationally in the future, but physically, materially in the past, dragged in many different directions. And where do our emotions lie? Our emotions only lie in the moment, right? I was told. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
I think my only thought is that it's so appropriate that we're having the conversation around temporal dislocation on Zoom, talking to people who are not here with us in this moment, but will be soon, and we'll be kind of projecting our thoughts outward to them even now. I think it's a beautiful note to end this conversation, to return to everyday, forgotten, hidden in plain sight flows and locales, to see that and to recognize music and other cultural practices as really fertile ground for intuiting these different kind of contradictory registers of decolonization, of climate change, and how we're able to listen to them as a polyphony in a way that we can't with other practices or other domains of social life. Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation very much. And hello, Anita.
Hello, Anita. You're going to join the polyphony with a new voice.
Yes, amazing. Oh my God. I have so much to bring with myself from this conversation and also from your presentation. So thank you so much, really. But would you like to add something else to the conversation, or you think that was it for you from your side?
I would like to ask people to contact myself if they are interested in carrying on. I may not respond very quickly, but I'm always curious to hear what people think and how this may relate. I feel that most good conversations begin on a one-to-one level. So please share my email, or I'll just speak it out. It's shzree.tan@rhul.ac.uk.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And me too. If yes, so once again, I apologize for the really laggy video presentation. That was actually just 1/3 of what I wanted to say and squeeze into 30 minutes, but I have a problem with time.
Don't we all?
But if you don't we all, right? Don't we all? So if you'd like to reach out and continue the conversation, I'm online at angeline.net, and that's Angeline with a J .net. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much to both of you. And we can also move on with the discussions to Discord, because we are going to be also online. So if there's any questions left from the audience, or you feel more intimidated being there and then without your name adding a question or chit chat about it, then of course we can also do that. We are going to be online in a minute there. So if there are any questions left, please come there. And also don't go too far, and I'm not talking to the audience, obviously, because our program is going further. At 4 p.m., we are going to go towards the Rethinking Music Ecosystem program. And the Black Swan and Oli Zhang will talk about many different things related to the topic of prototyping sonic institutions. So I think this is going to be also a very interesting program. And yeah, so see you around in, let's say, 2 hours. 2 hours and 10 minutes, we see each other. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the days and see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having us.